There's a photograph that hangs in the Wilkes County Historical Society. It shows 7 young women in wedding dresses spanning 50 years. All of them are smiling. All of them are daughters of the Wilkes family. And all of them were dead within 24 hours of when these pictures were taken. For nearly half a century, every daughter born into the Wilkes bloodline died on her wedding night. The causes varied: heart failure, accidental drowning, a fall down the stairs, choking. But the timing never changed. Midnight to dawn, wedding night, without exception. The local papers called it a coincidence. The church called it God's will. The family called it a curse. But nobody called it what it actually was until 1968, when the youngest Wilkes daughter walked into her reception hall covered in her groom's blood, holding a carving knife, and told the sheriff exactly what her family had been hiding in their marriage bed for 3 generations. What she revealed that night didn't just destroy the Wilkes name, it exposed a tradition so disturbing, so carefully protected that even now most of the records remain sealed. What you're about to hear has been pieced together from coroner's reports, sealed court documents, psychiatric evaluations, and interviews with the last living witnesses, people who were there the night the pattern finally broke. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. This is the story of the Wilkes family, a story about what happens when tradition becomes murder, when silence becomes complicity, and when one woman finally decided that dying quietly was worse than killing loudly. The pattern began in 1917, though nobody recognized it as a pattern yet. That requires repetition. That requires someone to be paying attention. Margaret Wilkes was 19 years old when she married Thomas Crawford in a small ceremony at St. Michael's Church in Wilkes County, Virginia. The wedding was modest but proper. Margaret wore her mother's dress altered to fit her smaller frame. The reception lasted until early evening. Witnesses reported nothing unusual. The bride seemed happy. The groom seemed eager. They left for the family estate just after sunset. Margaret was found the next morning at the bottom of the main staircase. Her neck was broken. Her wedding dress was torn at the shoulder. There were bruises on her upper arms, the kind that come from being gripped too tightly. But the coroner attributed those to the fall itself. Thomas Crawford was hysterical. He claimed he'd been asleep in their bedroom when he heard the crash, said she must have gone downstairs for water or air, said he'd told her to be careful on those stairs in her long dress, said he'd never forgive himself. The death was ruled accidental, tragic, but accidental. Margaret's mother was too devastated to ask questions. Her father accepted the coroner's report. Without challenge, Thomas Crawford left town 6 months later and remarried within the year. Nobody thought much about the bruises. Nobody wondered why a bride would leave her marriage bed on her wedding night to walk down a dark staircase alone. But Margaret's younger sister, Elizabeth, was only 14 at the time, and she remembered something nobody else seemed to think mattered. She remembered that Margaret had seemed afraid during the reception. Not nervous, afraid. She remembered Margaret pulling her aside and whispering something that Elizabeth was too young to understand then, but would remember for the rest of her life. "Mama told me what happens tonight." Margaret had said she told me what a wife has to do. "Lizzie, I don't think I can." Elizabeth thought she meant the wedding night itself, the intimacy, the vulnerability. It wasn't until 12 years later, when Elizabeth stood in her own wedding dress, that she realized Margaret had meant something else entirely. Something their mother had warned her about, something that was expected, something that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with duty. Elizabeth Wilkes married in 1929, just months before the stock market crashed and the world changed forever. She married a man named Robert Hensley, a tobacco farmer's son with good prospects and a respectful demeanor. Her parents approved. The town approved. Elizabeth herself seemed content, though those who knew her well said she'd grown quieter in the weeks leading up to the wedding. She drowned in the bathtub on her wedding night. Robert Hensley found her just after midnight. The water was still warm. Her head was submerged. He pulled her out, screaming for help, but it was too late. The doctor who examined her body noted water in the lungs consistent with drowning. He also noted something else: bruising around her throat and shoulders, defensive wounds on her forearms, but Robert explained those away easily enough. He said she'd been drinking champagne at the reception, said she must have slipped getting into the bath, said he'd tried to pull her out but couldn't get a good grip on her wet skin, said the bruise must have come from his attempts to save her. Once again, the death was ruled accidental. Once again, nobody asked the right questions, but this time people began to whisper. To Wilkes' daughters, to wedding nights, to dead brides. The Wilkes family had 3 daughters total. Margaret and Elizabeth were gone. That left only the youngest, Catherine, who was just 11 years old when Elizabeth died. Old enough to notice, old enough to be afraid. Catherine would later tell psychiatrists that she begged her parents not to make her marry, that she pleaded with them to let her become a teacher, a nurse, anything that would let her stay unmarried. But the Wilkes family had expectations, traditions. A daughter's duty was to marry, to bear children, to continue the family line. Catherine's fears were dismissed as childish anxiety. Her mother assured her that marriage was natural, that what happened to Margaret and Elizabeth was tragic, yes, but coincidental. Lightning doesn't strike 3 times, except it did. Catherine Wilkes married in 1937. She was 22 years old. Her groom was a banker's son named William Pierce. The wedding was larger this time. The Wilkes family seemed determined to prove that nothing was wrong, that their daughters' deaths had been flukes, accidents, bad luck, and nothing more. Catherine died of heart failure before dawn. She was 22 years old and had no history of heart problems. The doctor who examined her found hemorrhaging in her eyes, tiny burst blood vessels consistent with asphyxiation, but her throat showed no signs of strangulation, no bruises, no trauma. William Pierce said she'd simply stopped breathing in her sleep, said he'd tried to revive her, but couldn't, said she'd seemed perfectly healthy just hours before. The death certificate listed natural causes, but the whispers in Wilkes County were getting louder. Now, 3 sisters, 3 wedding nights, 3 dead brides, and all 3 had married into prominent families. All 3 grooms had been alone with them when they died. All 3 grooms walked away without suspicion. By the time the 1940s arrived, the Wilkes curse had become local legend. But legends aren't the same as truth. Legends can be dismissed, laughed at, tucked away as superstition. And that's exactly what happened, because the Wilkes family had no more daughters to bury. The bloodline passed to Margaret's son, Jonathan, who had been only 6 months old when his mother fell down those stairs. Jonathan Wilkes grew up knowing his mother had died tragically, but knowing very little else. His father, Thomas Crawford, had left town and wanted nothing to do with the boy. Jonathan was raised by his grandmother, Margaret's mother, who never spoke about what happened, who never mentioned the other deaths, who seemed to carry a weight that aged her beyond her years. Jonathan married in 1943, just before shipping out to Europe. His wife Dorothy was a quiet woman from a neighboring county. They had a daughter in 1946 after the war ended and Jonathan came home. They named her Anne, and Wilkes was a beautiful child, dark hair like her grandmother Margaret, her father's eyes, her mother's gentle disposition, and when she turned 18 in 1964, young men from 3 counties came calling. Her parents were careful about who they allowed to court her. They wanted someone respectable, someone kind, someone who would treat their daughter well. They chose a man named David Thornton, 23 years old, college educated, from a good family, and seemed to like him well enough, and the engagement was announced in the spring of 1965. But something strange happened as the wedding approached, and began having nightmares. She would wake up screaming, claiming she dreamed of women in wedding dresses, drowning, falling, suffocating. Her mother took her to a doctor who prescribed sedatives. Her father told her she was just nervous, that all brides felt anxious, but insisted the dreams felt like memories, like warnings. She married David Thornton on a Saturday in June of 1965. The ceremony was held at the same church where her grandmother Margaret had married 48 years earlier, and wore white lace. She smiled for the photographs. She danced at the reception, and at 11:30 that night, she and David left for the Wilkes family estate, where a room had been prepared for them, and was found dead in that room at 6 o'clock in the morning. She had been strangled, not with hands. There were no finger marks, but with something soft, a pillow, the coroner suspected, though he couldn't prove it. Her face was purple, Her eyes were bloodshot. Her body was still warm when her mother found her. David Thornton was asleep beside her. He claimed he'd heard nothing, felt nothing, said his wife must have died silently in the night, perhaps from some undiagnosed condition, perhaps a seizure, perhaps sleep apnea. The coroner's report listed asphyxiation of undetermined cause, but Anne's mother, Dorothy, didn't accept that, not this time, not after for generations, not after watching her daughter slip away. Despite every precaution, every prayer, every desperate hope that history wouldn't repeat itself, Dorothy Wilkes went into the attic of the family estate and began searching through boxes that hadn't been opened in decades. Birth certificates, marriage licenses, death certificates, letters, diaries, and what she found there made her realize that she'd married into something far older and far more deliberate than a curse. The documents Dorothy found weren't hidden. Exactly, they were simply stored where nobody thought to look. 3 generations of Wilkes family records, neatly preserved in cedar boxes wrapped in cloth that smelled of lavender and decay. She found Margaret's diary first. The entry stopped 3 days before the wedding. The final page had been torn out, but the page before it was still there. Margaret had written about a conversation with her mother, about what was expected on the wedding night. But it wasn't about intimacy or submission in the way Dorothy understood those terms. It was about something else. Margaret had written, "Mother says a wife must endure, that the first night is always the worst, that grandmother endured it and her mother before her, that it's the price of a good marriage, but mother won't tell me what it is. She only says, I'll understand when the time comes, and that I must not resist." Dorothy found letters next, correspondence between the Wilkes family and several prominent families in Virginia spanning back to the 1800s. The letters were formal, transactional. They discussed marriages the way one might discuss business mergers, and in several letters, there were references to the tradition and the understanding and the necessity of the first night. One letter dated 1873 was more explicit. It was from a Wilkes family matriarch to her daughter who was about to be married. Dorothy read it 3 times before she could believe what it said. "You must understand that what happens on your wedding night is not cruelty but necessity. Your husband will have been instructed by his father as all men in our circle have been instructed. The act is meant to establish dominance, to ensure obedience, to break the will early so that the marriage may proceed smoothly. You will be hurt. You may bleed. You may wish to scream, but you must not resist. Resistance makes it worse. Resistance is what killed your aunt." Dorothy's hands were shaking. She kept reading. "If you survive the first night, and most do, you will never speak of it again. You will bear children. You will manage the household. You will be a proper wife. The pain fades. The memory fades. This is how it has always been done among families of standing. This is how a woman learns her place." But not all of them survived. Dorothy found death certificates for Wilkes' daughters going back 5 generations. Not every daughter died, but enough of them did. Enough that it should have been investigated. Enough that someone should have noticed. Except the families involved were wealthy, prominent, protected. And the women who survived stayed silent, either out of shame or fear or the belief that this was simply the cost of their social position. Dorothy realized something that made her blood run cold. Her daughter Anne hadn't died from some mysterious curse. She'd been murdered deliberately, as part of a ritual that generations of men had passed down to their sons. A wedding night tradition designed to terrorize, to harm, to break the spirit of young brides under the guise of consummation. And David Thornton had killed her daughter while she slept, just as his father had likely instructed him to do. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Dorothy went to the sheriff with everything she'd found. But the sheriff was a man of his generation, and David Thornton's family had money. He listened politely. He took the documents, and then he told Dorothy that she was a grieving mother, that her imagination was running wild, that there was no evidence of foul play. David Thornton was questioned and released. Anne's death remained officially unexplained. But Dorothy had one more daughter, a girl named Claire, and Claire was only 16 years old when Anne died. Old enough to understand, old enough to be warned, old enough to decide that she would never let it happen to her. Claire Wills grew up in the shadow of her sister's death. while other girls her age were thinking about prom dresses and college applications. Claire was reading coroner's reports, while her classmates gossiped about boys. Claire was learning exactly how her grandmother, great-grandmother, and great-great-aunts had died. Her mother, Dorothy, made sure of it. Some might call it cruel to burden a teenage girl with that knowledge. Dorothy called it survival. She taught Claire things that mothers of that era didn't teach their daughters. She taught her about anatomy, where the vulnerable places are on a human body, how much pressure it takes to crush a windpipe, how long someone can hold their breath when a pillow is pressed over their face. She taught her about the legal system, how wealth protects certain men, how a dead bride's word means nothing, how the only testimony that matters is the testimony of the living. Most importantly, she taught Claire that no tradition, no matter how old, is worth dying for. Claire became obsessed with the pattern. She tracked down 3 other families in Virginia and North Carolina, where similar deaths had occurred. Young brides dying on their wedding nights under suspicious circumstances. Grooms who expressed shock and grief but walked away free. Families who closed ranks and refused to discuss it. In every case, the families were connected through business, through social circles, through generations of carefully arranged marriages. This wasn't a curse, it was a network. By the time Claire turned 21 in 1967, she'd identified at least 15 families who participated in what she called the breaking. She'd found records of 30 to dead brides over 90 years, and she'd come to understand that the men who did this didn't see it as murder. They saw it as discipline, as their right, as something their fathers had taught them was normal, necessary, even biblical. Claire also understood something else. The only way to stop it was to make it public, to make it impossible to ignore, to create a scene so horrifying, so undeniable that the authorities would have no choice but to investigate. She would have to get married. The man she chose was named Richard Hartwell, 25 years old, from a prominent family. His father had known David Thornton's father. Richard himself seemed kind enough during their courtship, but Claire wasn't fooled. She'd learned to recognize the signs, the way certain men looked at her when they thought she wasn't paying attention, the questions they asked about obedience and submission, the subtle suggestions that a wife's role was to yield. They were engaged in March of 1968. The wedding was planned for June, and for 3 months, Claire prepared. She saw a lawyer and drafted a letter detailing everything she'd discovered. She gave sealed copies to 3 people with instructions to open them if anything happened to her. She met with a journalist from Richmond who agreed to investigate the story if she provided him with proof. She even contacted the FBI, though they told her they couldn't get involved in what appeared to be domestic matters. And she bought a knife. It was a Bond knife 8 and long, the kind used in kitchens for precise cuts. She kept it wrapped in cloth at the bottom of her hope chest. She practiced with it in private, learning the weight of it, the balance, how it felt in her hand. She told herself she would only use it if she had to. She told herself that maybe Richard would be different, that maybe his family wasn't part of the network. But she also told herself that she would not die quietly like her sister, that if Richard Hartwell tried to hurt her, she would make sure the whole world knew why. The wedding took place on June 15, 1968. It was a beautiful ceremony. Claire wore her sister's dress altered to fit. She smiled for the photographs. She cut the cake. She danced with her new husband. And when they left the reception, at 11 o'clock that night, Claire had the knife tucked into her garter, beneath her wedding dress. What happened in that bedroom was never fully disclosed to the public. The court records were sealed. The psychiatric evaluation that followed was classified. But enough details leaked through witness testimony and police reports to piece together the truth. Richard Hartwell locked the bedroom door behind them. Claire said nothing. She watched him remove his jacket, loosen his tie, turn toward her with an expression she'd seen in her nightmares. He told her to lie down on the bed. She asked him why. He said she would understand soon enough, that this was how it was done, that his father had explained everything, that it would hurt, but that was the point. Pain was how a wife learned respect. Claire asked him if he knew what happened to her sister. Richard said he did. He said David Thornton had told him about it, said it had struggled too much, made it worse for herself, said if Claire stayed still and stayed quiet, she'd survive it. Most of them did. That's when Claire realized her mother had been right about everything. She let Richard approach the bed. She let him believe she was compliant, terrified, frozen. And when he reached for her, when his hands moved to her throat in the same motion that had killed for generations of Wilkes women, Claire pulled the knife from beneath her dress and drove it into his chest. She didn't stop at one cut. The coroner would later count 17 stab wounds. Richard Hartwell died on the bedroom floor of the Wilkes estate, choking on his own blood, while his bride stood over him, still holding the knife. Claire didn't run. She didn't hide the weapon. She walked downstairs in her blood-stained wedding dress, through the hallway where her grandmother Margaret had fallen, past the bathroom where Elizabeth had drowned, and into the reception hall where 60 guests were still celebrating. She found the sheriff, handed him the knife, and said 5 words that would change everything. He tried to kill me. The investigation that followed was explosive. The letters Dorothy had found were submitted as evidence. The journalist Claire had contacted, published his findings. The FBI reopened cases involving 7 other families. 3 fathers were arrested for conspiracy to commit assault. 5 men came forward and admitted they'd been taught the same ritual by their fathers, but had refused to go through with it. 12 more families were implicated, but never charged due to lack of evidence or because the participants were already dead. Claire Wills was charged with second-degree murder. Her trial lasted 3 weeks. The prosecution argued she'd lured Richard into marriage with the intent to kill him. The defense argued self-defense, presenting evidence of the generational pattern of wedding night deaths. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. They found her not guilty. The verdict didn't bring her sister back. It didn't undo 90 years of violence, but it broke the silence. After Claire's trial, 8 more women came forward with stories of surviving their wedding nights, stories they'd never told anyone, stories their families had pressured them to forget. The tradition didn't end completely. Some families were never exposed. Some men never faced consequences, but the network was shattered. Claire never remarried. She spent the rest of her life working with abuse survivors and lobbying for legal reforms. She died in 2003 at the age of 57. Her mother, Dorothy, lived to be 91 and spent her final years maintaining a private archive of everything they'd uncovered, hoping that someday the full truth would be made public. The Wilkes family estate still stands in Virginia, though it's been sold and renovated several times. The bedroom where Richard Hartwell died has been converted into a study. The staircase where Margaret fell has been carpeted over. The bathtub where Elizabeth drowned has been replaced, but the photographs remain at the Historical Society. 7 young women in wedding dresses spanning 50 years, Margaret, Elizabeth, Catherine, Anne, and 3 others whose names rarely appear in the records, all of them smiling, all of them dead within hours of those pictures being taken. All except one. Claire Wilkes stands at the end of that row of photographs. She's wearing her sister's dress. She's holding a bouquet. And if you look closely at her eyes, you can see something the others don't have. Not hope, not joy, but determination. The look of someone who knew exactly what was waiting for her in that bedroom, and who had already decided she would rather be called a murderer than die. Like the women who came before her, the curse of the Wilkes family wasn't supernatural. It was just men passing violence down to their sons and calling it tradition. It was just women dying silently because they'd been taught that suffering was virtue. And it only ended when one woman decided that the cost of breaking the pattern was worth paying, even if it meant destroying her own life in the process. Sometimes the monster isn't hiding in the shadows. Sometimes it's standing beside you at the altar, holding your hand, promising to love you until death do you part. And sometimes the only way to survive is to make sure that death comes for him.